Hello, this is the eighth in the series of podcasts looking at introductory paganism. This time I've had a few questions around festivals and festivities. What pagans celebrate, why they celebrate it, and so forth. So if you bear with me, I'm making more apple cake as we talk. The last lot went down well, so I thought I'd make some more. Let's adjust this slightly. There we go. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of books out there explaining the Wheel of the Year. Festivities, 8 major festivals that take place over the course of a year. Often passed off as ancient pagan, they're not. They're a combination of some elements that are celebrated by some cultures and other elements celebrated by other cultures overlaid by more recent traditions. So within the 8 festivals popularised in books on Wicca and general paganism, you'll find elements from Irish sources, elements from Saxon sources, elements from Greek sources, and so on. It's a bit of a mixture. So there was no one single ancient culture that celebrated the whole lot. Rather than just rehashing the stuff you can find out in 101 books and websites about the Wheel of the Year, I thought I'd talk in more generalised terms about what pagans celebrate, why they celebrate it, and so forth. An awful lot of the festivities that we can see in the ancient world, even amongst those quite urbanised cultures like Rome and Athens and so on, essentially stemmed from rural traditions, from celebrations of the field, of the life cycles of animals, particularly animals that were of great importance to those cultures, usually for food, sometimes for other things, wool production, that sort of stuff. Just trying to cut my fingers off here. Therefore, even when those cultures had gone large scale and urban, they were still celebrating the things that had been important to them in the early days and on which their survival depended in terms of food production and things like that. So they recognised the importance of celebrating life. And you could certainly say, if we ask the question, why do pagans celebrate? Well, pagans celebrate for much the same reason anybody else celebrates. Life is short and you may as well enjoy it whilst you can. The chances of something horrible happening to you are far too likely, so make the most of it when life presents its opportunities to celebrate, which is why, for example, the Jehovah's Witness Church, or movement, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't celebrate birthdays. Partly, I suppose, it saves the expense of presents, but mainly it's because they regard the celebration of birthdays as fundamentally pagan. And in all fairness, they're not far wrong. Ancient cultures celebrated the birthdays of the emperors. Better off people often celebrated their own birthdays, even some evidence of the relatively poor celebrating their birthdays, not quite the way we do today, but not only would you celebrate the harvest, but you'd celebrate the fishing seasons if you lived near the sea. You'd honour the gods of the ocean, the gods of the tide, who brought you good fishing harvests, who gave you good sailing if you were a merchant and off on ships to other parts of the world. Would celebrate your own survival, which is basically what a birthday is, celebrating the fact that you're not dead yet. Any excuse they could find, in essence, to celebrate. And that, you could say, embodies a lot of pagan ideals, that life is there for the celebrating at all sorts of levels, both in terms of successful agriculture, successful production of food and so forth, but simply things like birthdays as well that have continued existence. It's the rejoicing in life, rather than being terribly, terribly serious all of the time, ever so parsimonious as can happen in some other philosophies and some other religions. The pagan ones are about rejoicing, and that forms a strong feature of many of our festivities, that they are fun, they're celebratory, they're sort of noisy and loud. Not maybe quite as much these days as they used to be. Obviously, back when the entire village or the entire town were pagan, then you would get big parades through the streets and singing and dancing and rejoicing. These days, that tends to annoy the neighbours if you do things like that. So, because paganism is much smaller scale these days, the celebrations tend to be somewhat smaller accordingly, not quite as raucous as they once were. Although you do still get some larger scale events. In terms of what individual pagans can celebrate, those pagans who follow a cultural path like heathenry, druidry, Cometicism and so on will often celebrate the events that were important in the ancient world to those cultures. So they'll go along with the cycles of previous centuries, if you like. However, there's nothing to stop people adding festivities to their calendar. It's not necessary to do a sort of strict historical recreation where only the things that were of importance to the past are celebrated. And that's something worth reflecting on, not only for people who are new to paganism, who presumably are listening to this cast to find out a bit more about paganism, but also including people who've been knocking around it a while, who are reflecting on where they're at, where they're going in their paganism. It's too easy in the modern world to get locked into what you might call book-bound paganism. That is to say, you go to a bookshop or the library or wherever, you pick something off the shelf by your favourite Wiccan or Druid or Heathen or whoever it happens to be author, and they say, oh, this is the way it's always been done, and then you end up replicating it. It's a good place to start, in all fairness. You've got to start somewhere. But one thing we can see sign of in the ancient world is the importance of place. Going back to what we were saying about whichever podcast it was, the idea that the very word Paganus means of the place. If you're going to celebrate your land, let's say you're a druid for argument's sake, and you look at books on druidry and they tell you that in ancient Ireland the winter was celebrated at the start of November and the lambing season was celebrated at the start of February, which is all quite the case and all well and good. However, put a little bit more water in this. However, if you happen to be a druid in Australia or in Canada or China or Japan or wherever, and you want to celebrate, the tides and cycles of those lands are quite different from the tides and cycles of Ireland, but either ancient Ireland or modern day Ireland, with its climate has changed a little bit in the last few thousand years. So should you be book bound and say, well, according to this book it's February the 1st, therefore I have to do this? Or should you respond to the actual environment you're living in? So if you are living in the edge of a huge Canadian forest, you're living in some very hot desert country, you're living in Australia where the seasons are all the other way around than they are in the northern hemisphere, would it not be more sensible, and many pagans go down this line, of listening to the local land and celebrating its tides in its way? So winter when it starts in that land, spring when it starts in that land, rather than going by a book that tells you what some other point in time, some other part of the world celebrated events, particularly those events that are geared to nature. It's slightly different if you are, for example, following the Religio Romana, ancient Roman religion, which, as well as agricultural festivals for things like the vineyards and so on. As well as that, they also had festivals to celebrate big political events like the founding of Rome itself. And that's a static event, it's based upon a historical date. and it's not tied into agricultural cycles. So there are some events in some forms of paganism which are not particularly nature related. They're more to do with the successes in battles, the founding of the city-state, all that kind of thing. So you could celebrate that on the same day regardless of what part of the world you live in, because it's not a natural tide. But for those that are natural tides, returning to this argument, it's worth, I think, moving away from book-bound paganism into the celebration of events as they unfold in the part of the world where you live, and celebrating the land as it is in that part of the world, rather than, as some book tells you, it was in a different part of the world in a different period of history. In a similar vein, you might want to think about the nature of agrarian festivals. So we mentioned an old Irish festival at the start of February, the Feast of Imbolc, which was initially very much geared around the lambing season and a way of toasting the goddess of the sheep and the farms and so forth. If you hardly ever eat lamb, or you're a vegetarian or a vegan or something, is there a particular reason why you should want to celebrate an event in the lambing agricultural calendar? Might you not want to prefer to celebrate something of more relevance to you? So if, let's say for argument's sake, you eat an awful lot of beef, you hardly ever touch lamb, would it be more pertinent, because you depend heavily upon cows for your diet, to celebrate important stages in the life cycle and the seasonal tides of cows? That said, you've also got to factor in, of course, that cows these days aren't left to their own natural tides and devices through modern farming techniques, constant insemination of cows to ensure they're forever having young, they're forever in milk. The modern day cow is not living the sort of lifestyle that a cow 2,000 years ago would have led, and that has a big impact on the natural seasons of its life. So should you recognise the world the way it is and celebrate the kinds of biological tides that cows go through in the 21st century? Or should you rather go for a more idealistic, more naturalistic view and celebrate those tides as they would happen for a cow that's left to its own natural devices and not manipulated against its nature by human beings for their own gain and profit? Something worth thinking about. Obviously, in talking about cattle and lambs and so on, I am emphasising the idea of animals for food. And in all fairness, if we look at a lot of ancient pagan festivities from any part of the world, food plays a hell of a big part. That's why I'm always cooking and eating, I suppose. Well, that and the fact that I'm a greedy soul. But you can celebrate the tides and cycles of creatures that are important to you for something other than a purely culinary reason. So creatures you never eat, you could celebrate them because you find them beautiful, they play a significant role in your life in some other capacity. So if you are, like a couple of pagans I know, a very horsey person and you love riding and looking after horses, you don't eat them. Well, not in this part of the world, you don't. But those horses play a huge significance in your life as friends, as a mode of transport, as a being that you exercise alongside and so forth. And therefore you might want to celebrate the major cycles of the horse lifestyle, the natural cycles of the horse. The ancient Gauls and other Celtic nations worshipped Epona, the horse goddess, for example, and it's highly likely that they would have reverenced her when horses were in season, when horses were giving birth, at other significant times and tides of the horse lifestyle. So it doesn't just have to be things you consume, it can be creatures you honour for other reasons in other ways. And not just animals. So if, like me, you eat an inordinate amount of cake, and therefore wheat and similar plants play a significant role in your diet, once again, sorry, back to food. People are going to be convinced I do nothing but eat. The important tides in the life of that plant are worth celebrating. The sowing seasons, the growing seasons, the harvesting seasons, and so forth. Again, it doesn't have to be only plants that you eat. You might want to celebrate plants that you're a gardener, you just happen to think they're very, very beautiful plants, even though you don't eat them. Whatever context you use those plants or work with, maybe that's a nicer way of putting it, use sounds a bit exploitative, doesn't it? However you engage with those plants. How much of this is 450? If it has a role in your life, why not celebrate it? Why not rejoice it, give thanks for it, commune with it? What is the purpose of those celebrations, aside, as I said a little earlier, just to have a bun fight and a party and any old excuse to celebrate life type thing? Bit over the top there, aside from that kind of celebratory angle, what you might think of as a frivolous isn't quite the right word. That sounds all very po-faced and puritanical, but a light motivation behind engaging in things. There's also the sense that by celebrating a particular animal, a particular plant, a particular landscape feature, you could be celebrating the tides of the sea. You might live near a forest and you want to mark the major events in the life cycle of that forest, the emergence of the leaves, the falling of the leaves and so forth, buds and flowers, what have you. Not only is it an excuse for a little bit of fun, a little bit of a party, but it's also a chance for you to communicate. So coming back to what we've said in previous sessions about animism, maybe in a second I'm just... Right, it's 2:30. It's a way of communicating with the spirits of those plants, those animals, those landscape features that have significance and importance to you. And that's a worthwhile activity in and of itself. Ooh, making quite a mess of this, never mind. Therefore, the purpose of a celebration, of a festivity, is both, if you like, to give thanks, to reflect on the things that you are grateful for and thankful for, to communicate with other living beings that you are expressing your thanks and gratitude to expand your understanding of them. There's a sort of a learning element to any festivity. Let's say you're communing with some deity or another, an ancestral spirit, a landscape spirit, whatever the thing happens to be. You are learning about it in the process. It, conversely, of course, is learning about you. And that's worth bearing in mind, that ritual is a two-way street. We get very human-centred in our daily lives, especially these days when the world, generally the secular world, is very, very human-focused and barely gives a second thought. Well, actually, let's face it, half the time it doesn't give a thought to most other humans, let alone anything that's non-human. It's just the elites that get taken into consideration. But even so, we do get very human-centred. Therefore, ritual can become a time in which we try to put aside brain space to remember we are not the end-all and be-all of this planet. There are other things on it. They have their needs, their desires, their likes, their dislikes. And we can work with them, we can engage with them, we can assist them in various differing capacities. Oh, I've got to see what I can. Ritual can become a time for pausing, for reflecting, for contemplating where we're going. One of the festivals within the type of paganism I follow, within Druidry, is coming up very soon. Samhain, which happens at the end of October, early November, coinciding with the more secular festivities of Halloween. It's for us a time of looking into the coming winter, of the idea of darkness, of reflecting on the notion that the life of a plant begins in the darkness of the earth as the seed is nurtured and grows before finally it emerges into the sunlight. The life of a mammal begins in the darkness of the womb before it emerges into the sunlight. The life of a bird, of a reptile, begins in the darkness of the egg before it hatches and emerges into the sunlight. All things begin in darkness. And so the year for us as well, and there's a dispute about exactly when ancient pagans, or ancient Celtic pagans at any rate, celebrated New Year's, but for modern ones, Samhain is for the majority a sort of New Year's feast. It's seeing the idea of the year beginning in darkness, beginning in winter, and it's a time to think about what the new, like any kind of New Year festival, to think about what the year is going to hold, what it's going to bring, what we want from the year, what seeds we can sow, what we're thinking about growing in the sunlight of eventually of spring and of summer. So it's a looking forward, and having that time when you can sit with friends, with family, with loved ones, both the living and the dead, and think about what the year ahead holds for you, where you're going in life, all of those sorts of big issues, is valuable. It's an important activity. I do realise I'm rambling all over the place with this, trying to multitask and proving that I'm not particularly good at it. But one thing I would like to focus on and get people, listeners, thinking about, aside from the mess I'm making from doing this, is that festivity tends to be communal. And that's a slightly awkward one, in that there are an awful lot of pagans in the world who describe themselves as hedge witches, hedge druids, hedge various other things as well. The idea that they are practicing what they do alone, by themselves. That's not a bad thing in and of itself. I'm not against that. I've done plenty of rituals by myself over the years, and there's definitely sometimes a benefit to doing things by yourself. For one thing, you don't have to put up with really annoying people. And I have been in groups in the past that did involve some really annoying people. But the joy of communal ritual is that you come together. Community and communion are both related to the word for breaking bread. And yes, we are back to food again. It's my Freudian obsession at the moment is stuffing my face. But that's important, and it's not just humans you can break bread with. You can break bread with your pets, with the local wildlife, with the trees, the plants. Perhaps not literally bread when it comes to plants, and pouring water on their roots and that sort of thing, giving them fertiliser around their roots. Giving respective types of food to the various creatures that you are sharing with is a particularly good thing to do. It's the sense that engaging in festivity, I'll get this back thing, is a chance to share. It's not a kind of, even if you are by yourself, you can still go out into the woods, you can share with the wildlife, you can share with the trees, even if you're not sharing with other human beings. It's a chance to engage in other forms of sharing. And that's a very positive thing to do. That's a very useful state of mind to bear in mind, is to consciously share, consciously observe the other beings around you, their needs, their wants, their hopes, their dreams, their fears, their likes, their dislikes, so that just as if you were catering for a room full of human beings, and you would know this one is vegetarian and that one is allergic to garlic or whatever it is that they're allergic to. You would cater accordingly. You would try and factor in what your guests liked, what they didn't like, knowing that you've got so many drivers, so they can't be drinking booze, they've got to have soft drinks. You'd be thinking of all that kind of thing. And you can take that same awareness and apply it to the non-human, whether we're talking plants and animals and wildlife, whether we're talking your pets in your house, whether we're talking ancestral ex-humans who are participating in your festivities, whether we're talking gods or elemental spirits or whatever it might be, that you are fundamentally thinking much less of yourself and much more of other beings, because it's very easy to become exceedingly self-focused. Particularly in the culture we live in at the moment in the West, it is very self, me all the time. So it's good to think of the existence of others and to make them welcome and engaged. And that could easily argue, I certainly would argue, is a large part of what the festivities are about, that kind of welcoming and engagement. In whatever context you're celebrating, whether you're celebrating a seasonal event, whether you're celebrating the founding of Rome, or some historical event, whether you're celebrating your birthday or the flowering of the local woods, whatever it is, that it's a time to be with others, to remember that no one is an island, no one is isolated. Even the loneliest person is surrounded by other living entities, and certainly if you believe in the orders of spirit, is surrounded by the non-corporeal beings as well. And it's a chance to recognise our community, the groups of which we are a part, and celebrate that. So to recap that idea, it's looking at what festivals you celebrate. Some of them will perhaps be part of whatever tradition that particular pagan cleaves to, if they cleave to any. But also to think not just kind of doing it just because it says it, you've got to do it in the book, doing it because it has a meaning to you, a value to you. So if you want to celebrate the time at which the corn is harvested, you're doing it because you eat corn products, you like your bread, your cakes, your whiskey, whatever else. You are appreciating the role of that plant in your life, or the lives of the people around you. If you're celebrating an event in the life cycle of sheep, of cows, of goats, of whatever creature it may be, you're doing so because those animals are important to you. They may be important to you as food, they may be important to you as pets, or you just think they're beautiful, wonderful creatures. I feel like that very much about wolves, and events in the lives of the wolf are important to me. So I celebrate the Lupercalia in February, which is an old Roman festival, which happens at approximately the time when European wolves are mating. So there are significant events in the lives of all sorts of beings, and you could, I've mentioned the founding of Rome, you could as equally think in terms of when your local town, village, city, or whatever it is that you live in, when was that founded? So for example, where I live, the Royal Charter back in the year 1200 was signed at the end of May. And so at the end of May every year for the last good few years, we've come together as a local community to commune with what the Romans would have called the La Prestite, the guardian spirit of the town, the founding, overviewing entity that looks after the place that I live in and the place that the other people who participate in the festival live in. It's not an ancient pagan festival going back to the year dot, but it is a recognition of this idea that communities have spirit, have their guardian presences, their entities, their inner core and essence, which is a product of all of the people, the animals, the creatures that live in a particular geographic region, how we all come together to make a community. It's a recognition of that and a wish to honour and celebrate that. So wherever it is that you live in the world, whether it's a small village or an enormous city, a little bit of historical research will probably pinpoint a day of significance to that community, when it was first founded, when some important building was first, the foundations were put down, it was something of that sort, which could serve as a focal point for trying to bring people together. And not just pagans, you might well find people of all sorts of religious and non-religious persuasions are interested in celebrating the day in which your community takes significance. Obviously, lots of countries around the world have independence days, foundation days, marking not just for a city or a village, but for an entire country. That can be incorporated into a pagan calendar. So again, whilst it's all very important and well and good to understand the festivities that were important to ancient communities, ancient Germanic, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Celtic and so forth communities, you can also incorporate modern day festivities into your pagan calendar to mark what is important to you. If you're a member of a group, a Druid group, a Wiccan group, a Heathen group, whatever, and you can say, well, we first started 7 years ago in April. Why not have a festival in April to mark your 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th anniversaries as a working group, marking the fact that you came together and you are still together as a community, that has importance to you. There's all sorts of different ways you can celebrate. In terms of what you do in the celebration, there are endless books out there that tell you how Wiccans cast circles, how Druids set up groves and ceremonial spaces and so forth. I don't think there's an awful lot of point me just endlessly repeating something you can very easily find for yourselves. But the ins and outs of how you set it up, how you do it, how you go through all of those practicalities are less important, I think, personally, than your reasons for doing so, what brings you together, what makes you celebrate life. And it's thinking about the things you do, why you do them, how you do them, that are particularly important. If you like, the technicalities of what you do when you get together are of secondary importance to your reason for coming together in the first place. And so I'm not going to sort of explain to you how Wiccans cast a circle or any of that, because as I say, you can easily find out for yourselves. But just to leave you with reflecting on the whys and wherefores of what you do, what pagans do, what you might think about doing in the future if you don't already celebrate things that you're at that sort of wavering shouldn't I stage. It might sort of help to inspire ideas around what is important to you, what's significant in your life, the life of your household, the life of your community and so forth. What I'll finish by saying, whilst faffing around with all this and making a right mess, is that in any ritual where you come to a particular place, it could be your own garden, it could be a spare bedroom you've converted to use as a temple space, it could be going out into the woods, up the mountain, on the beach. I've even known people do it on a roundabout once, but that's a whole other story. Wherever it is you go, when you go there, bear in mind that the chances are, especially if you're an animist, there's already somebody there. As an animist, you might think of it as the spirit of place. The little beings in the woods and the mountains and on the beaches who occupy that place and are watching you turn up and thinking, what on earth are they up to? If you're not particularly animistic in your outlook, then you could think of it in terms of the creatures that already live there, the plants, the animals, the insects, all the rest of it, who again are conscious of you and your friends, however many people it is, turning up. It's only polite, it's only civilised when you turn up to somebody else's place, to somebody else's space, to make sure they're okay with you being there. So, as well as looking into all these books that will tell you how to cast circles, what coloured candles you'll need, whether you need to walk to the left or walk to the right, and all that kind of palaver, give some thought to who is already there. And before you begin your ceremony, your ritual, your celebration, whatever you want to call it, take time to communicate with who lives there and make sure they're okay in your holding that ceremony there. If they say yes, they are, fantastic. Please do make them a bit of an offering, food, drink, what have you, include them in the service. If they say no, they don't want you there, and that could be a no, don't ever come here ever again, or it could simply be not today, thank you very much, come back next week, then respect that. They've got good reason for not wanting you there, and it's just plain rude to impose. Not only rude, but you'll annoy them, and they'll probably disrupt your ceremony and your festivities. So if they say no, move on. The question I'm sure somebody will ask is, how do you know if they say yes or no? You can sit quietly and meditate. You can, for some people, casting runes and tarot cards and what have you becomes a way of communicating with a lot of spirit. Other people lay back and go into a trance and have a visionary state. There's all sorts of different ways that people do it. But it's just taking time to allow the beings you are talking to give you an answer, to give you an understanding about whether or not they want you there, and if they want you there, they might give some guidance on you. We would like such and such a thing as an offering in exchange, or not in that spot, please use that spot a few yards over there, that kind of thing. So you are sensitive to the land you are working in and working on, even if we are talking your spare bedroom or your back garden, because you're not the only person who inhabits your house or your garden. Not only are there the birds and the flowers and the rabbits in the garden, but even in your house, where there may not be much in the line of birds and flowers and rabbits, there will be past inhabitants of the house, the spirits, the Yathin, the entities, the Donovioi, if you want to be Russian, who live in that space, and they might not want you using that room, but they might prefer you to use a different room for festivals and ceremonies and so forth. So just to be sensitive that celebrations should involve a rejoicing for everyone, and not the inconveniencing or annoying of some people, in order that others can have a bit of fun and a bit of a party and a bit of a celebration. It's just like respecting your next door neighbours when you're having a party, that you don't have the music so loud it drives them to distraction. You want to be accommodating and welcoming to all, and that needs to be part and parcel and factored into your ceremonies, your acts of reverence and worship. I think that's probably far more than enough, and now everything's in the oven, I need to tidy up, so I'm going to leave it there and talk to you perhaps another day about this, or if not, I'm sure there'll be storytelling or poetry or something at some point in the near future. Take care.